Printers, Part 3. In this nugget, we continue our discussion of printers with Part 3, and this is the conclusion of our printers discussion. We'll talk here about maintenance of the printers. What kinds of things do you have to replace? What kind of things wear out? What kind of things deplete? And what kind of things are serviceable by you? You can't actually service all of them. Also, we'll take a look at troubleshooting your printers, and of course, this is a big part of an A+ exam in terms of the exam objectives. So we'll take a look at a variety of different possible causes for printer problems. Alright, as we get started talking here about maintenance, let's address why I talked to you about some other topics a little bit earlier on. Remember in the first nugget that we talked about printers, we talked about all the specific details of a laser printer. Now it comes to light why we need to know some of those things. For example, in the paper path, you notice that the paper has to go from its tray all the way through the whole process. It has to go underneath the drum. It has to get the toner transferred to it. It has to be ejected past the fuser where it has to melt everything on there. Well, because of that, you understand that there's rollers inside of that laser printer that can get worn down. Very often, if you have a laser printer that people complain seems to jam all the time, chances are the rollers have gone past their shelf life or past their usable life, and they're no longer efficiently transporting the paper through its path. So that's a very big reason why that might occur. So you might need to replace those rollers. You may also need to replace the fuser. This would be the case if people get their print jobs and either all or part of the print job smears. It's just a powdery toner on there in some portions, and some of the portions, other portions might be melted on, but not all of it. Well, it could be that the fuser's bad. So that would certainly be something you can replace as well. Now remember that when you do replace the fuser, actually you replace anything on a laser except for maybe possibly the toner itself, you should turn it off and unplug it, because especially things like the fuser are highly electrically charged, and you don't want to endanger yourself in any way with those. Okay. Now also you may have a maintenance kit. Depending on the printer manufacturer, for example, Hewlett-Packard makes these, it will include kind of a life cycle maintenance kit. So it's kind of like with your car, at every 30,000 miles, have a complete inspection, have, I don't know, the fuel injectors cleaned, and all this kind of stuff. There's a whole grocery list of things that have to be done maybe at 30,000 miles. Well, that's kind of the same with printers. After a certain number of pages, maybe after 10, 20,000 pages, maybe you need to take a maintenance kit, and that may include the rollers. It may include a new fuser. It may include additional components within that laser printer that you can replace all those parts. The maintenance kit is normally not going to be available for consumer level laser printers, because quite frankly, it's cheaper just to replace the laser printer entirely. I mean, you can get them for $100 now. So very often that's what will happen. But for higher end laser printers that are in corporate environments, you don't just throw the printer away. You can replace it, the parts, much cheaper with a maintenance kit. Also, when you do that, when you replace things with a maintenance kit, usually you have to remember to reset the count. For many of these higher-end corporate-level printers, they will know that it needs maintenance after a certain page count, and it will probably show up on a display, or with many of the fancier printers, it can even send an email to the administrator when it's approaching its maintenance kit lifetime, and it'll remind you that you need to get a new maintenance kit and replace those parts. If you never reset the counter, there's no way of knowing whether you've printed enough pages or not. So you have to reset that when you do the maintenance kit. Also, toner is probably the most frequently, or actually the second most frequently replaced item on a laser printer. Can you guess what the most frequently used item is that you have to replace? The paper, yeah. In fact, if users complain that the printer queue on their end of things seems to be jammed up and none of the print jobs seem to be going through, first thing I would always check the paper to see if it's run out. That's very often the case. Anyway, then you'll also have a waste tank, and there are different names for that. Just depends on who the vendor is. But especially for a color printer, remember, the toner is not recycled back into the toner cartridge, but it has to still be scraped off of the drum. And so it's going to get filled up inside of a waste tank that you may periodically have to replace. Now, I've taken some of those, and they say that you're supposed to just buy new ones. Usually what I do is I'll just kind of empty them out and put them back in. Maybe that's cheating. I don't know, but it saves me an awful lot of money. And then for inkjets, what you'll usually do there is, number one, you might want to look at the nozzles because they may need to be cleaned. This is going to be the case if users complain that the quality of the print jobs is not good, or they're getting lines through the print job. Horizontal lines across the page. Very often that's because the nozzle needs to be cleaned. Or if the color balance looks weird, especially for photographs. Again, one of the inkjet nozzles might be clogged up, and so it's not delivering enough, cyan or enough magenta or whatever color it is. Also, it could be an issue of alignment. This will also be the case, again, if you get banding in the print job. This is because the print head might not be perfectly lined up the way it should be. There's usually utilities for both the nozzle cleaning and alignment from the manufacturer, or you can usually push the menu buttons on the printer surface to be able to access menu items that allow you to do both of those things as well. The other thing would be ink. Now, there's most frequent thing you're probably going to do on inkjet printers is to replace the ink. They're very thirsty, and the ink is expensive, so part of life. You'll have to get used to that one. And then there's sometimes a waste tank that might need to be replaced as well. Normally, this is only going to be on higher end of printers, because what actually happens is if it makes borderless prints, it actually has to do a little bit of overspray past the edge of the paper, and there's other things that cause these inkjet printers, the higher end ones, to actually kind of waste a little bit of ink. So what's it going to do with that extra ink? Well, it just kind of disposes of it, and it puts it in a waste tank that you might have to replace. Those can cost anywhere between $30 and $90. So again, another thing you have to pay for. You might need to be aware of some other maintenance items, such as the printer properties. Maybe you need to adjust whether or not it prints out of tray 1 by default, or tray 2, or whether it prints envelopes, or what kind of card stock it needs to use, that sort of thing. Maybe the page sizes. Also, separator pages, and this is useful for busy printers that have multiple users that share them. It's difficult sometimes to discern where your job begins and the other user's job begins. Okay, so you can print separator pages in between individual print jobs. And then there's also spool settings, which adjust the things such as the performance and where the main work of the print job is performed. And in order to show you all of that, it's best if I actually just demonstrate that by going to the properties of a printer. And I'm going to right click here and run this as an administrator, but I'll go to our properties. And then as we continue on through this, you'll see that I can do a number of different things, for example, through the Advanced tab. Now, as an example of this, you'll see here that it says always available or available only during certain hours. And I can then specify those hours. That might be useful if I have a printer that I only really be wanted to be used during off-peak hours. Or maybe it's a very loud and noisy and large dot matrix printer that we only want to use to print reports during off-peak hours when everyone else is at home, and it just runs at night, something like that. So that could be one item I could do. If I have multiple print objects that print to the same physical printer, then I can adjust the priority as well. So different printers have a different priority. And when I say that, by the way, it might sound kind of confusing. See, I actually have one physical printer. I have only one of these Canon printers, and it's sitting right behind me. But I can actually install the same printer twice in Control Panel here. I could actually have that, and I could have another one, down here as well. In the interface here in Windows, it sees them as separate printers, even though they're the same physical printer. Okay, so let me actually get back to my dialog box here, if I can get to it. And what I could do with this then is if I had a second one installed, I would say that maybe that one is a lower priority. Okay, the lower the number, the higher the priority. So if I could set up a number of 50 for the other one, for example. And that way, anybody that printed print jobs through that other one would be a lower priority than the initial one. Here's where I could choose a different driver. You saw that earlier. Spool print documents so the program finishes printing faster. What happens with this is that when you print a print job, it does some maneuvering of that print job on the local hard drive and in the local user's computer. And it has to do that in order to combine the document that they're trying to print with the actual print driver, and there's certain printer codes that it has to prepare and so forth, and then it shoots it out to the printer and the print job goes on. What I could do though is I could spool them so that it starts finishing faster, getting tangled up there, but I can start printing immediately. This means that I don't have to wait for the entire spooled print job to complete first. As long as there's at least one page available, it can start printing the very first page out of, let's say, a 400-page report. On the other hand, if I choose this one, then it has to wait till it spools the entire 400 pages to disk, and then it will spit it all out to the printer. Okay. Normally we choose this one because it just starts printing faster. I can also print directly to the printer, which means that it's not going to use any of that local spooling, which actually helps performance, so it just print directly. Normally, you don't want to do that unless you have some kind of a compatibility problem or there's some other prevailing reason to be able to do that sort of thing. Oh, I also was talking about the separator page. Here, I would just choose to browse for a separator page, and that would be, a graphic or a simple text document that I might have created in the past and saved it with an SEP extension. And then I could use that as my separator page. And then the other most important part of this is the actual printing defaults. So, for example, what I actually do with this printer for my own productivity is I make this one a two-sided printer, because that way, since it prints on both sides, it saves paper. It takes a little bit longer to flip the page around inside the printer and print it out. But overall, I save a lot of paper. Presumably, I save 50% on my paper expenses for larger print jobs that are more than one page. And the rest of this is somewhat specific to the vendor, but you can choose a lot of the different options, which pretty well explain themselves, whether we want to use plain paper, whether we want to use legal size paper, any of the different kinds of things that you might want to otherwise select. You can also go to the finishing tab here, and you can specify whether or not it's going to be something that's bound, for example. You can go to the quality side over here, and you can specify what kind of objective it has. But generally speaking, general is going to use the least memory. Now remember, the printers also have memory in them, and if you choose something that's extremely elaborate, like photos, for example, this kind of thing requires a lot more memory in order to be able to handle it, because it has to be able to accept an entire page worth of data in memory and then print it out before it can clear the memory to accept the next page. So if they're pretty elaborate, then you do have to make sure that you have enough memory for something like that. But those are some of the settings that you can configure for your printer. Now let's take a look at some troubleshooting issues here as well. A big part of the troubleshooting with the laser printer, or actually any of the printers that we've talked about, is in the proper configuration and setup of them in the first place. So if someone's complaining about a problem with the printer, or it's been set up, someone tried to set it up, but it never works in the first place, go back through and make sure that it's been set up in the way that, that I've shown you here to make sure that it's properly done. Otherwise, you may have a variety of other problems that could occur. Things that are related to the paper that you're using or the media, for example. Part of that could be paper jams, and I guess I've kind of really addressed that down here as well. And why would paper jam? Well, we talked earlier about the rollers that could be wearing out. But another issue you might run into is moisture. Now, I live in Phoenix, Arizona, where it's very hot and arid, very dry climate. So we have very few problems with humidity that might affect paper. In fact, in the middle of the summer on a 100-degree day, you walk outside and your skin starts to just crack right on your body. I mean, it's that dry around here. But in some organizations, especially if those that are not in air-conditioned or perfectly controlled environments, if they're trying to print stuff out, humidity can really affect that paper or that media. So that might be one thing. Now, you can't suddenly make things not humid, but just be aware of the fact that that could be what's causing the problem. One thing you might want to do is, if you have troubles with the humidity there, you might try to give a little bit more distance by fanning the paper before you put it in the tray. And most manufacturers recommend that you do that anyway. And that may help that part of it at least a little bit. The other thing relates to whether or not the user is using the correct media. For example, maybe they're trying to print out mailing labels that are not rated for a laser printer. It could be then that those are getting stuck inside of the laser printer and causing all kinds of problems, and there's adhesive everywhere. Or they're using those transparencies that are not rated for a laser printer, and the fuser's melting them, and they're getting stuck and jammed up. That could be really quite messy. So take a look at those kinds of things when it comes to paper and or media. Another kind of thing you might run into with the wrong paper or the wrong media would be, for example, if you use a glossy type of a paper that's made for laser printers, for like cover sheets or something like that, and it's used inside of an inkjet printer. Well, for inkjets, the substance that they print on top of has to be able to absorb that ink in certain ways. For example, for glossy photo paper, it looks like the ink would just smear right off, right? Because it's glossy and shiny. In reality, it's a resin coating on there that's designed so that it will be able to absorb the ink into it, even though it looks like it would be slick. So it would work for that. However, if you're trying to print on a shiny, glossy type of a paper that's rated for a laser printer, then it very likely with an inkjet printer, it could smear right off as soon as you pick it up and your fingers rub up against it. Many times you'll also run into problems with the printer queue. Now the queue is the list of print jobs that have been sent to the printer but that have not been completed yet. For example, if we take a look at this print queue, we see that I've got a couple of print jobs in the print queue and they have not been completed yet. In this case, it's because I chose to use the printer offline. I went to printer and used printer offline. Now, why did I do that? Only for demonstration purposes, because otherwise these would have printed out so fast it would have been hard to demonstrate what's in the print queue. They would have just disappeared while I was trying to talk about them. So I kind of put them on pause, so to speak, in that certain kind of way. Now, if the printer is offline, or the user wants to use the printer offline like I've done here, why else would they want to do that besides for my reasons? This could also be the case if they have a whole batch of print jobs that they want to be able to access all at once and print all at once. So they don't care if there's other people's print jobs that are going through right now. When they get done with all the stuff they want to print, then they'll just queue them all up, and then they'll just click here to release the printer from being offline and dump all of their print jobs out at once. That way they don't have to sort through some of their print jobs and other people's print jobs that have gotten interspersed. That might be one reason. Another one would be if they're on a laptop and they're just out of the office. Well, of course, they're not going to be able to print to the printer. So what they could do is it could go offline, and then when they come back into the office, it may come back online automatically. They're supposed to do that in many cases. But if not, the user may need to go here and deselect this check mark so that it comes back online and sends the print jobs out that they selected to print while they were out of the office. Other things you can do with this queue, though, and let's just assume that this was an active queue and the printer was still online. I could just say, hold on a second, I don't want that one to go right now. I'll pause that one. And then that would then make room for other print jobs to go on through. Now, if you have the ability to manage the printer so that you've got something like the Manage Documents permission set. Remember, we looked at permissions a little bit earlier. Well, if you've got permissions like that, then you can take other people's print jobs and you can cancel them. That's always a lot of fun, kind of baffles people as to why their print jobs never show up. Or you could restart them or pause them. You could do any of these things to other people's print jobs. Also, another thing that's kind of interesting is sometimes you can go to the properties of this and identify some additional characteristics that might be of interest to you. For example, you could see if it's on a schedule so that it's only set to print from certain times or what kind of priority it's at and things of this nature that we looked at earlier. Another thing to think about with this print queue, by the way, is let's say at this top job right here, I'm going to unpause that for now, just for a visual reference, so I'll resume that. But let's say that there was corruption in this or something like that, and it kind of hung up the spooler. Well, if that's the case, if that's a corrupt job, it might have stopped the printer because the printer's trying to figure out what to do with this and it's getting confused. Then I might have a dozen other users underneath here that keep trying to print, but they can't because this top one keeps causing a problem. So what I might do there is I would have to either cancel that or I might consider restarting it. Sometimes that'll help as well. Normally, print jobs are easy enough to create. It's not like you can only print one and then never print another one just like it. They're not one-of-a-kind items. So I'll normally just cancel those items, and then you'll get prompted to say yes. And then that should allow the rest of the queue to go ahead and continue processing. Another thing to look at there would be the spooler. Now, we talked about spooling earlier as one of the properties for the printer and whether or not it starts printing after the first page is spooled or whether the entire document has to spool first. That's different than the spooler. This is actually a service. So let's go ahead and take a look at where you can find that in Windows. If I go to, actually you can do this a couple of different places. If you have administrative tools available on the Start menu, that's one place you can access it. I'm going to go ahead and go to the Properties here to go to the Start menu so that I can then customize this and show administrative tools on the Start menu. And you can see here I'm making it available now. Okay, that's how I would do that. Now, once that's been made available, I can go to Administrative Tools and go to Services. I could have also right-clicked on Computer and chosen Manage, and it would have been one of the items that's available under there as well. I'm going to the Standard View here just so we have more screen real estate to work with, and I'm going to go down to the Spooler Service. The Print Spooler Service, actually. So that would actually be further up here alphabetically. There it is. There's sometimes will stall, or you might see over here that it's supposed to be started automatically, but it might say stopped, or there might be other problems with it. One thing you could do is to right-click on this as an administrator and choose Restart. Okay. The other thing that I normally do is that's a lot of clicking to do for me, and I kind of know the command line method for doing this, so I'll just go to an administrative command prompt instead, and then I'll just do a net stop spooler, and then press Enter. And then it'll stop the spooler service, and then a net start spooler, and press Enter. Now, another thing I might consider doing there is, I actually usually do all of this on one line. If I do a net stop spooler, followed by an ampersand, net start spooler, then it'll do this first thing, And when it's done with that, it'll be connected with the ampersand, and then it'll just move on to the next thing. So you can concatenate or combine commands using this ampersand item. By the way, also, as I press enter on here, you might notice that this first part of it just appeared kind of automatically. What happened there? In a command prompt window, if you use the up and down arrow, you can cycle through previous and last commands. So I'm just pressing the up and down arrow to go through all of those, and that's another thing that you can do. But sometimes you do need to restart that spooler. Also, you might just simply need to reset the printer. Sometimes it gets confused by a corrupt print job or something like that, so you may need to reset it. Normally this is going to clear out any print jobs that are currently in its memory, but not in the spool on the computer side of things. So in order to do that, there might be a menu option that you can use, or a button that you press and hold down on the face of the printer. It just depends on the vendor and the manufacturer. Or you can also just go to the back of the printer, and usually there's a physical power switch that you can flip off and then wait a couple of seconds or a few seconds and then flip it back on, and that very often seems to address things as well. Sometimes you might also see certain status or error messages that you'll just have to look up in the manual or go online and find out from the vendor what they mean. I mean, it might say on the little LCD screen, error status 51. What does that mean? I don't know. I remember a long time ago I had a printer that would never give you in plain language what the problem was. It would say, well, again, error status 51. What is that? Well, I had to go look it up, and it says error status 51 means it's out of paper. Well, couldn't they have just said that instead of giving me this obscure error message? But sometimes you do have to look them up, and so just check those out. Also, sometimes you'll get network or sharing issues. This one can be kind of related to the status and error messages. If you see that the network, if it's like on an Ethernet connection, and then you look at the printer port where the Ethernet cable plugs into the printer, normally there's going to be lights there that blink, that identify things such as whether or not it's active, or possibly even the speed of the connection. Sometimes if there's nothing that appears there at all, then it could be that the network card has gone bad. And in order to confirm that, one of the things you can do, depending on the vendor, is you might cycle the printer, which means just to turn the printer off, then turn it back on, and then it could be that one of the status or error messages that will appear will tell you a network-related problem that's going on, or it was unable to detect a network card or something like that. A lot of these printers actually have small network cards that if you unscrew the cover for them, you can actually replace them. They may be a field replaceable unit that you would just have to order from the manufacturer and replace. Let's also talk about sharing. Now, again, sharing, a lot of that is just setting it up right in the first place, but if it's not set up properly or has a permissions problem, you can go into the sharing item here, and although I'm in Windows 7, the interface here for the security is pretty much going to be the same. Then I can just make sure that the right people are selected and the right privileges are selected there. For example, in this case, again, everyone has the ability to print to this printer. And again, just remember that if somebody's been added into this list and they've been given the deny print permission, that overrides everything. In this case, if I deny print permission to everyone, that would include even me as an administrator. So deny is a pretty overwhelming permission that would prevent people from being able to print. And then as we talk about additional troubleshooting issues you might run into, one of those might be that you're just getting blank pages. How in the world is that going to happen? Well, a couple of different things can cause this. Number one, you might have defective toner. That would be something I would be aware of. Not all toner comes out manufactured properly, or something in the cartridge is wrong, or it's not releasing toner, in any number of things. Or maybe there's the corona writer is not properly attached, and so it's never electrifying properly the toner drum. So those are certain kinds of things you can look at. Another reason might be that you might have a bad driver. So for example, you can actually use drivers that you might not have readily available. Maybe I'm in an isolated office and I wanted to install the Epson 4880, but I don't have any of the drivers for it. However, we have an older Epson 4800 printer driver around on a CD. That actually might work for most of the print properties that I need to use. Just some of the additional new features of the 4880 might not work with the 4800 print drivers. On the other hand, it could be entirely incompatible. So you might be getting something like blank paper that just prints out instead. Another reason why you might get blank paper or partially printed jobs, for example, maybe you've got a highly intense graphic of maybe it's a high resolution portrait of somebody here, and that's what it's supposed to look like. But when it prints out on the page, you only get this much, the top of their head, and then the rest of this is blank. That's normally going to be a memory issue because there's not enough memory in the printer to handle that complex print job. And then it also might just simply be, a corrupt document. That just does happen sometimes. If it doesn't print out the first time, try it one more time and see if it prints out properly. If not, then you may have one of the other problems that I talked about. Now, other things you might consider here if you're having memory problems is, well, maybe you can't upgrade the memory today, or it's on order, it's not going to get here for another week, or something like that. How are you going to get this fixed today? Well, if this again is a high-resolution image, number one, you might consider reducing the resolution. A lot of lasers right now are printing at about 1200 dpi. You might reduce that down to 600 or even 300. And usually in the driver somewhere, there's an option where you can do that sort of thing. Of course, at 300, it's not going to look anywhere near as good at 1200, but at least you get the print job printed out if that's the most important thing. Another thing you can do is if it's a graphic object that you're using like in Photoshop or something, normally those go through line printers, which is what an inkjet printer is, because it prints one line at a time. It doesn't really need gigantic amounts of memory. Whereas a laser printer is a page printer, and it has to take the whole thing into memory before it can print out that page. Well, if you are trying to print that on a laser that needs more memory, you could go into Photoshop or whatever the application is and reduce the size of it there. Because you might be printing maybe to a photograph that's normally 30 by 40 inches. Well, you can reduce the size of it so that it's going to fit on an 8.5 by 11, and that might help you there as well. And then finally, I would just recommend if you have software that does this, such as the professional version of Acrobat, like Adobe Acrobat Pro, for example, you might just convert it to a PDF. A PDF will be much easier to print out and lighter on memory than an original, maybe PSD Photoshop document that might be hundreds of megabytes in size. Also, if you're just getting garbage print, almost always that's a driver problem. It's either the wrong driver or there's a compatibility problem with the driver in your current operating system. You might need to get an updated version from the vendor. Or it's just the driver itself has just gotten corrupt. You need to reinstall the correct version of that driver. But garbage print where you just get strange characters and letters or hex stuff all over the printing surface. And this is also the case if it prints out indefinitely. It might be one page you're trying to print out, and yet it's printing out 20, 30, 40 pages on that printer of all this garbage. Again, that's another indication of it. Another indication would be just empty pages. Sometimes a driver problem will just print out empty pages, again, seemingly without end sometimes. If you get ghosted images such that you're supposed to be printing out an image looking like this, but when you print it out, in the background, you can see faint lines from a previous print job. Maybe there was a document that was printed out with words on it. Now, what's that about? How come I'm kind of getting a 2-for-1 sale here? I'm getting 2 print jobs in one. What that usually means on laser printers is that there's a bad erasure lamp. Remember, with laser printing, one of the first things that it does is it cleans off the previous print job. Well, it uses a lamp to shine upon that photosensitive drum. And that's normally found in the laser printer, not in the cartridge itself. And it usually shines through a little slit or an opening in the cartridge. Well, if there's a problem with that lamp, either it's not as intense as it needs to be, or it's burnt out, or it's not working, then it's probably going to have to be replaced. You may not be able to replace that, might have to be sent in. The other reason why that might be occurring is, maybe the lamp is fine, but remember there's also a cleaning blade that cleans off the excess toner from the previous print job. And if there's something wrong with the cleaning blade or it's not making good contact with the drum, that might also be another reason why you're getting ghosted images from previous print jobs. If you're getting lines across the page, remember, with an inkjet, again, that could be the alignment of the print head or clogged nozzles. So you might have to address both of those possibilities. And with a laser printer, you don't see that very often. But if you do, it could be because the fuser has gone bad and it's not properly heating up the page, causing the toner to stick to the paper properly. If you're getting problems with smearing, remember, with inkjet, it might be that you're using the wrong paper. Maybe it's some kind of a glossy paper that's made for lasers that you're trying to put ink on, and it's not absorbing properly and drying properly. So that could be an issue with that. With a laser printer, again, that usually goes to the fuser. If it's not working, then you're just going to have powder on a page that doesn't melt, and it's going to make a big mess. Also, by the way, if you do get that toner on yourself, maybe it hasn't been fused on properly, now you got it all over your hands, and it might have gotten on your clothes or something, which can also happen when you try to replace a toner cartridge. Be very careful that you do not wash those clothes in hot water because, of course, toner is made to melt. So only use cold water in cleaning up after a spilled toner. As long as I'm on the subject of toner, I might also point out, if you get a print job that comes out and it's also got strange spots on it, sometimes that's also an indication of a bad toner cartridge as well, and that may just have to be replaced or sent back to the manufacturer for a refund. Also, don't forget, and this is a big A+ issue, make sure that you print out a test page as you get started. The first thing you should do is print out a test page, and then the last thing you do after you think you've come up with a solution is to print out the test page. And this helps to eliminate software that's being used to print instead, whether it's CorelDRAW, Photoshop, Word, whatever it is that might also be interfering with that print job. As long as you can get a good test page, then you know that Windows is communicating properly through the driver to that printer. You know what, I think I want to bring up a couple of other issues here. Let me tack on a couple of additional items. With drivers being updated, driver update, let's say, especially on a shared printer. When this happens, let's say that the printer is being shared from my computer, and I download and install an update to the drivers. What happens to everybody else that's using my same shared printer? Well, actually what takes place is Windows detects that they have an older version of the print driver, and it should automatically update the print driver on their end. But that's only the case if I've shared it from Windows to those users. If it's a TCP/IP printer where they install all of it on their end, and they're not sharing it through my computer, then they have to update those printer drivers themselves. Another thing to consider there is if you do a driver update, whether it's shared or just a local printer, either way, then very often, remember, some of those print installation utilities, those driver installation utilities, will automatically set the default printer to whichever one it is that you're updating, and that's not always the desired behavior. In this nugget, we concluded our discussion of printers with talking about maintenance. For example, what kinds of things can you replace? Remember, there's sometimes a maintenance kit, which when you replace it, you also have to reset the counter so it knows when to warn you again that you need to replace those parts. Normally, you're not going to see that kind of thing except for on larger, more expensive corporate-level printers, not usually on consumer-level printers. But there's a number of different things you may also need to adjust on any kind of printer, such as replacing the ink, replacing the toner, checking to make sure the paper's not out. Also, we'll take a look at troubleshooting issues. Remember, with troubleshooting, a lot of it's just making sure that everything's hooked up and properly configured in the first place. Otherwise, you can take a look at certain things that might have worn out or that are not functioning properly, like the fuser, or maybe the rollers are not properly working anymore, or you have corrupt printer drivers and all kinds of things of this nature. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.